That Defense Secretary Mark Esper said during a news conference at the Pentagon earlier today. He told reporters that he would not support President Trump invoking the Insurrection Act.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations.
So you can hear the defense secretary is really not in line with the president on his threat to deploy active duty U.S. troops on U.S. soil to quell these protests. And there are a lot of questions about the defense secretary's job security as we head into this briefing, Dana.
All right, Kristen Fisher, thank you. I'm sure we'll see you at the briefing. Want to bring in Ed Henry. He is co-anchor of America's Newsroom. And Ed, this morning, the news that Esper made happened during your and Sandra's show, America's Newsroom. And in some ways, because the reporting overnight wasn't perfect, but that it was more peaceful over the nation, does that maybe mean that you wouldn't even need the Insurrection Act, that perhaps the governors and the mayors have more of a handle on things now?
Perhaps, and perhaps the president gets some credit because he was pushing the governors and mayors to get stronger. And a lot of people don't like that. They think it's too tough. Maybe it's not diplomatic. It's not nuanced enough. But the president sent a clear message a couple days back that everybody had to get tougher. And guess what? As you say, last night, the protests were calmer, as peaceful. People, we should respect the right to protest. People want to petition their government. We should also point out though, that some of the reporting from a couple of nights ago was false, which is that, there was all this talk that really spun this up into a controversy, that pepper spray and whatnot was used. And as you know, the U.S. Park Police has now come out strongly and said that was not true. Nonetheless, pushing peaceful protesters out of the way for a photo op wasn't a good look for this White House. And it certainly wasn't a good look for the defense secretary. And I think it's very clear he was trying to clean that up.
Well, and I also think that when you're explaining pepper balls versus pepper spray, I mean, it's not necessarily a good one to have to do.
Sure.
But I also can understand that the president himself may not have known. He also told Brian Kilmeade today that he didn't go to the bunker there at the White House. I had assumed that if he had gone, it was because the U.S. Secret Service had said that was what they needed to do to protect him. But he said he didn't go. So, again, that's a story insignificant compared to the violence, the destruction,
exactly. It's sort of this
looting,
sidebar
the
story,
theft, the depravity, right? So now you have the press secretary is going to come out and talk today. Obviously, she's going to get some of those questions. But how do they start moving the story forward today, do you think?
Well, look, I think as I've reflected on the last day or so, if you think about what former President Bush did with a very eloquent statement about how saddened he is by all this and how he thinks there should be a constructive conversation on race moving forward, I think we're going to hear remarks from former President Obama in a couple of hours with My Brother's Keeper, his nonprofit. We should respect that. You've got leaders from both parties saying, how do we get unified and whatnot? But those are words. The current president, President Trump, has to also deal with action, has to deal with these protests, and just as importantly, deal with the looting. I mean, look, I'm not going to make it about me, but when I hear people on this channel and other places claiming that the looting is exaggerated and stuff, I saw it in my own neighborhood a couple of nights ago, and a lot of our colleagues live near where I am, and it was horrifying what was going on. Not for me personally, for small businesses that were hit hard by COVID and are just coming back, and in my neighborhood here in New York have been destroyed. And who's going to help them out? And not a lot of people seem to care quite as much about that. This president has to, A, deal with taking action. Again, as I said a moment ago, some people might not like that he talks tough and the rhetoric and all that. But secondly, he also does have to find a way, as former President Bush and former President Obama are doing, in terms of the diplomacy of it, unifying the nation. That's something, obviously, is not his first instinct, this president, which is nuance. But presidents have to try to bring the country together. The president did that
Right. So I felt like I was anchoring on Saturday afternoon. I felt like the president did that before his remarks at the Space Center. But again, the facts on the ground, what people see with their own eyes and ears, what happened there in front of the church the other day with the protesters. You had a lot of reporters there, eyewitnesses that are like, wait, that's not what happened. So if you have a great idea for the president, you have to figure out a way to allow him to make those remarks in a place where they're going to be memorable and not pushed aside for something else, because his speech about space was also very good. Because of the facts on the ground, it got buried. I am a little curious, though. When I saw the description of President Obama's remarks tonight, it was described as remarks to the nation. Now,
right.
Because of technology, all of us could give remarks to the nation at any time. I could announce today that Jasper and I are going to give remarks to the nation at 6:30 p.m. and I hope you join us. But it is something different to say that you only have one president at a time.
Right.
And I understand a lot of people are pressuring these former presidents to comment, and perhaps President Obama can say something that will be helpful and constructive and hopeful. But we're also in the middle of this presidential election.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you think about that, like the combustible nature of all of this.
Yeah, well, look, our friend and colleague, Karl Rove, your former colleague in the Bush White House, I asked him this morning on America's Newsroom about the fact that you have all of these Trump critics now saying that the statement that former President Bush put out a day or so ago was in fact, as I said, eloquent, but that it was somehow aligning him more with where Joe Biden is approaching it, and it was some sort of a rebuke of President Trump. Karl Rove said that's nonsense, as you know, that former President Bush knows there's one president at a time. He's not trying to undermine President Trump. And so I think, yes, it's combustible in this environment. This president, President Trump, has to find a way, as I mentioned a moment ago, to bring the country together, at least try. But I think in fairness to him, people have to give him a chance to do that as well, and not just, he wants to go to a church that was burned and demonstrate faith, but also demonstrate strength. And everybody in the world seems to want to throw stones and say it was the worst thing they ever saw. Let's put this in perspective. The church was on fire. Small businesses have been destroyed. And the country's been torn apart in some ways. This president has responsibility, as I say, to unify and not just throw stones himself on Twitter or somewhere else. But give the man a chance. And when given that chance, he needs to rise to the occasion, obviously.
All right. Ed Henry, thank you and stay safe getting home tonight. We have a Fox News alert now. We're getting breaking news on the charges against the officers involved in George Floyd's death. And it's not just the one who dug into the man's neck for more than 8 minutes. We have the details for you next. A Fox News alert, Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar tweeting moments ago, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison is increasing charges against Derek Chauvin to second degree in George Floyd's murder and also charging the other 3 officers. This is another important step for justice, as we've been hearing from protesters and from the Floyd family. Let's bring in the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, Melvin Carter. And Mr. Mayor, I wanted to talk to you about some really remarkable scenes in your city, but let me get your reaction to this breaking news that that Keith Ellison, the Attorney General there, is going to increase the charges against Chauvin and apparently charge the other 3 officers.
Thank you very much. I think that's absolutely critical. Everyone knows that the basic job of a police officer is to help when people are hurting. And so when we look at this video and see Officer Chauvin committing this gross atrocity against humanity against George Floyd, when we see that video of his murder, there's also a wrongdoing there. I've heard people say the officers who did nothing. That's inaccurate. Those officers assisted, they helped hold him down, they guarded the scene while it was happening, and that's unacceptable as well. All 4 must be charged. All 4 must be held accountable for their actions.
Do you believe that these additional charges will help the peaceful protesters feel like they have been heard and that justice is on the way, and perhaps help quell the violence as well?
I think these charges will help people feel a little bit more that it's possible that maybe someone will be held accountable for George Floyd's murder. But let's be clear, none of this started with George Floyd. We have seen life after life taken African American, unarmed, unaggressive men and women whose lives have been taken in just hauntingly disturbing and unacceptable ways definitely over the past 10 years. But let me tell you, even before there were camera phones, my father and my grandfather and his grandfather could tell you about these exact same scenes playing out. The anger out in the community is real and it's understandable. And I think what's really going to help people feel a sense of justice is not just knowing that this one case is going to be followed up on, but knowing that we as a country are ready and willing to do the deep, soul-searching type of work that it's going to take to make sure that this can never again happen in our country.
To that end, describe the scene for me earlier this week when you led an attempt at reconciliation.
I appreciate the question. You know, we woke up, same as everyone did, to just the haunting images on Tuesday morning of George Floyd's murder. Every member of humanity I know, our police officers, our CEO, our neighborhood activists, my neighbors in my community, look at that video and say that is just unacceptable. We cannot accept that as the status quo of how law enforcement operates in our community. And I think it's important to note that the anger that we've seen around it, that the rage, that this enormous energy that we've seen around it is understandable. And the truth is, feeling angry about that is really the only human response. Unfortunately, there are some who manifested that anger in ways that were destructive and unacceptable and ended up further traumatizing and re-victimizing the same communities that are already traumatized by that video, the same communities that are already traumatized by the history of violent policing in America. We can't do that, but we have to continue this energy. We have to continue to protest. We have to continue to press impatiently to make sure that the focus stays on the facts, that George Floyd should be still alive, that all 4 of those officers responsible for his death must be held accountable in a court of law, and that we have that deep work to do to prevent this from ever happening again in our community. So our call here and nationwide for me is for peace. Let's express our energy in a peaceful way, but not patience. Let's never return to patience. Let's not ask people to sit and wait while we slowly and incrementally slow the tide.
Mr. Mayor, I need to get to the White House briefing. I appreciate you. Thank you for coming on the show. We'll stay in touch.
White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany briefing reporters. Let's listen in. Peacefully made a powerful march and a powerful point that all Americans should be treated equally, that racial discrimination was unacceptable, abhorrent, and that it needed to be rectified. And in the famous I Have a Dream speech by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, he said this: "We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force." And soul force is exactly what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. met the nation with when he said this: "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Important words, important actions from an American hero who contributed to making this nation the greatest on earth. With that in mind, we must remember to recognize the lives lost, the passing of George Floyd, who was killed unjustly in a horrific video that we all have seen. And we must also remember the passing of police captain David Dorn yesterday, who was shot and killed by looters in St. Louis in an absolute tragedy. A retired officer, 77 years old, whose wife was also a police officer herself. Dorn was a hero and an unfortunate casualty in the riots we have seen. Our hearts are with his family. We are all Americans. We must come together. We must unify, and we must have law and order. And with that, I'll take questions. Yes, we do.
I have a couple questions. First on Secretary Esper. CBS News has learned that his remarks this morning were not received well here inside the White House. Had the Secretary ever expressed his views about active duty forces to President Trump before this morning in private? And does the President still have confidence in Secretary Esper?
So not that I'm aware of in terms of expressing his opinion, and I wouldn't get into the private conversations that went on here in the White House. And with regard to whether the president has confidence, I would say if he loses confidence in Secretary Esper, I'm sure you all will be the first to know.
But as of right now, he still does?
As of right now, Secretary Esper is still Secretary Esper, and should the president lose faith, we will all learn about that in the future.
Thank you. And on policing, Vice President Joe Biden has vowed to set up a police oversight board if he is elected. Is President Trump considering anything comparable or any other specific legislative and policy reforms to address racial disparities in policing?
So there have been various things discussed here in the White House. I don't want to get ahead of the president and as to what he ultimately determines. The president believes that most police officers in this country are good, hardworking people, and he notes that, but he also notes some of the injustices we've seen and the need to make sure that the appropriate use of force is used and that our officers are trained in that capacity.
So he is considering some sort of federal oversight?
There's been discussion of various proposals that we could look at, but no announcements on that front just yet. Jim.
Kayleigh, you mentioned Dr. King. He likely would not have approved of what took place Monday evening across from the White House, as you probably know. If the White House president and his team had to do it all over again, would you have gassed and pummeled protesters to clear the park so the president could have a photo op?
So let me first address no tear gas was used and no rubber bullets were used. So again, no tear gas was used, no rubber bullets were used.
Why making that distinction? Chemical agents were used.
Let me back up.
We talked to an Episcopal priest who said she was gassed. Others say they were tear gassed in that area.
Well, no one was tear gassed. Let me make that clear. That's been confirmed by DOD and by Park Services as well. So let me go back and address what happened because there's been a lot of misreporting. First, I would note that these protests that were going on in the morning, AG Barr had determined that we needed to expand the perimeter by 1 block on each side. He was surprised, AG Barr, when he arrived at the White House to see that that perimeter had not been moved. So he said that we needed to get going with moving that perimeter. He told the officers that out there. That was late afternoon. So that decision was made in the morning, first of all. The protesters were told 3 times over loudspeaker that they needed to move. And what happened was it grew increasingly unruly. There were projectiles being thrown at officers. Frozen water bottles were being thrown at officers, various other projectiles. And the officers had no other choice than in that moment to act and make sure that they were safe and that the perimeter was pushed back because, as we all know, a church was burning in that very area the night before. So the appropriate action was taken. It was taken. It was burning the night before, which enforced the decision to move the perimeter on each side by a block, so that church would no longer be in harm's way by the rioters. But it's absolutely uncalled for to throw bricks. Absolutely uncalled for to throw water bottles that are frozen at police officers.
Don't you agree, Kayleigh, that the vast majority of those protesters were doing so peacefully, and that many of them did not hear those warnings and were simply just pushed out of the way, just forced out, pummeled out of the way by their fellow Americans, police officers? You sent in members of the military to deal with this. I mean, what do you say to Americans who look at what happened on Monday and find that to be appalling?
Well, let me note the National Guard was utilized across Washington, D.C. The military was not. There is a distinction, and I would say that it is uncalled for to throw bricks at officers, uncalled for to throw frozen water bottles at officers. And they also had received intelligence that there were calls for violence against police officers, and they found caches of glass bottles, baseball bats, and metal poles hidden along the streets. When an officer is at risk, they have the right to defend themselves. They did so peaceably. There were no fatalities, no severe injuries.
You do it again.
To protect the lives of officers, they have a right to defend and to protect themselves.
And the White House.
Next question. I think Sarah used to always joke about 2 Question Tuesday. I think sometimes I get 4 or 5 Question Wednesday.
I just want to make sure that people who have a problem with what they saw Monday have a chance to have that addressed. And, I mean, what do you say to Americans who are just outraged by what they saw? And the president to go and have a photo op in front of a church.
What I would say is this: officers have a right to defend themselves. And I've watched a lot of your coverage. I've watched a lot of the nation's coverage, and let's go through some of the things that happen when officers don't defend and protect themselves. In St. Louis, 4 police officers were shot. In Las Vegas, an officer was shot in the head and is on life support. In New York, a cop was beat up by people. In Providence, 4 to 5 police officers and state troopers were injured. And in Ashbury Park, New Jersey, a police officer was injured. Police officers are out on the front lines. They're defending and protecting you as you come into this building each and every day, Jim. We owe them honor. We owe them respect. And when they are under attack, they have the ability to defend themselves. Zeke.
Just first on Secretary Esper's comments, is the president presently considering invoking the Insurrection Act, or is that completely off the table at this point?
So it's a very good question. The president has the sole authority to invoke the Insurrection Act. It is definitely a tool within his power. This president has one singular aim, and it is protecting America's streets. We cannot have burning churches. We cannot have police officers who are shot. We cannot have businesses that are looted and destroyed. The Insurrection Act is a tool available. The president has the sole authority, and if needed, he will use it. But at this time, he's relying on surging the streets with National Guard. It's worked to great effect here in D.C. and in Minnesota as well.
And Kayleigh, back to that incident on Monday, are you saying that all the officers who were at that protest, clearing that largely peaceful protest, were acting appropriately? There were well-documented incidents of one case, one member of law enforcement bashing a camera of an Australian journalism trooper. This isn't about the journalists. This is about the other peaceful protesters there as well. Did every officer in that protest, was that protest cleared in a way that the White House believes was entirely appropriate? So that should be the model for the rest of the country.
I think U.S. Park Services, when having bricks thrown at them and frozen water bottles, had the right to act. They acted with the appropriate level of force to protect themselves and to protect the average citizenry and to protect the peaceful protesters who were among them as well. Kristen.
They were protecting the peaceful protesters by firing various chemical agents and walking through them with batons.
Well, it wasn't tear gas, I would note, and what they used was a way to target those who were being violent. They used the minimal force that they could to ensure that situation was safe, to ensure St. John's Church would not burn a second night in a row, and to ensure that no officers were injured in the manner that I listed off, that several officers have been injured and shot at in the course of these riots. Kristen.
Thank you, Kayleigh. I have a question about the decision-making process before going to the church on Monday night. The president said on Fox Radio this morning that he never told anyone to push the protesters out. The defense secretary, he said something similar. So who at the White House did know, or was this a unilateral decision by the Attorney General?
The Attorney General decided that morning to expand the perimeter, and that was a decision made long before the church discussion was ever under consideration. When the president gives an order, people act. It's not as if he's walked through each and every detail of how a plan goes about. He says, I want to go to the church. He goes to the church, and everyone executes the plan in the order that the president puts into place. So the president is absolutely right in what he said.
So was the plan still for President Trump to walk out there, even if the protesters were still there?
I'm not aware of the determinations that Secret Service had as they arranged for the president to walk out there, but I would just note again that the decision to expand the perimeter was a decision made in the morning by Attorney General Barr.
Okay, and just one question about the coronavirus, because we're still in the middle of the pandemic. Dr. Fauci, he said in an interview on Monday that his contact with President Trump had dramatically decreased, and so had the frequency of the coronavirus task force meetings. Is that accurate? And if so, why?
There was a coronavirus task force briefing just yesterday. We are constantly, as an administration, monitoring the coronavirus to protect the safety and well-being of the American people. Right now, we all saw that church burn. We all saw some of the violence in the streets, and the president has had several meeting after meeting with AG Barr, Secretary Esper, General Milley, to make sure that our streets are peaceful and under control, while also monitoring the coronavirus and what we're seeing develop there. Mario.
Thanks, Kayleigh. I'm confused. I mean, if the protests were peaceful on Monday, why did you all clear the area, and whose decision was to clear it later in the day? If Attorney General Barr wanted it cleared earlier in the day, why did it take so long for it to be cleared?
Yeah, he ordered it to be cleared Monday morning. It didn't happen when he arrived, so he immediately instructed the officers to ensure that it was moved back a block. As we all saw Sunday night, it was not a peaceful protest. It was, in fact, a riot with a church burning in Washington, D.C. The president made sure that Washington, D.C. was secure Monday night. night, and part of that involved moving the perimeter back to ensure that St. John's Church was protected.
But that's quite a gap between the morning and then the evening when you all walked over there. Why was there such a gap?
Look, again, that's a question for AG Barr, who made the order. It's a question for the officers who were on the ground at that time, why that wasn't deployed right away. But when AG Barr came to the White House, I think it was early afternoon, he noticed that it hadn't been cleared, gave the order for it to be cleared, and that action took place.
Why did the president feel it was important to go walk over there through the park into the church?
It was extremely important. Look, the president wanted to send a very powerful message that we will not be overcome by looting, by rioting, by burning. This is not what defines America. And going and standing by St. John's Church was a very important moment. And I would note that through all of time, we've seen presidents and leaders across the world who have had leadership moments and very powerful symbols that were important for a nation to see at any given time to show a message of resilience and determination. Like Churchill, we saw him inspecting the bombing damage. It sent a powerful message of leadership to the British people. And George W. Bush throwing out the ceremonial first pitch after 9/11. And Jimmy Carter putting on a sweater to encourage energy savings. And George H.W. Bush signing the Americans with Disabilities Act, flanked by 2 disabled Americans. And for this president, it was powerful and important to send a message that the rioters, the looters, the anarchists, they will not prevail, that burning churches are not what America's about. And that moment, holding the Bible up, is something that has been widely hailed by Franklin Graham and others. And it was a very important symbol for the American people to see that we will get through this through unity and through faith.
Separately, the president, you said he had the results of his physical. We know that he did part of the physical late last year, I think it was. When did he have the rest of it done?
I'm not aware of an exact date. I will ask Dr. Connolly for you on that, but I know it was fairly recently. Yes. I will go to Brett.
Thanks, Kaylee. The White House has spent a lot of time talking about how the protests have taken place and how people are protesting or shouldn't be protesting. But what is the White House doing to address the underlying causes that have led to these protests?
Look, the president's done a lot. The president expedited the review, the FBI review of the George Floyd case. He swiftly ensured there was a civil rights investigation into George Floyd's death. Ahmaud Arbery, there's another investigation there on the part of DOJ. He's recognized what an injustice this was innumerable times, including in his national remarks that he gave on Saturday. So this president has done everything in his power to send a powerful message that these injustices will not be tolerated.
But does the White House or the president, have they reached out to any of these protesters to try and start a dialogue about specific reforms they'd like to see, or does the president plan to do that moving forward?
Look, the president has looked at some various, not legislative necessarily, but tools that we could use to ensure that law enforcement uses the appropriate level of force. No discussions or announcements there on that front. But I will say that we're taking a hard look at this, but that the president recognizes that our police officers are valiant heroes. The vast majority are good, hardworking people who love this country and who love the American citizenry that they protect.
Thanks, Kaylee. Former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein testified today on the Hill that he didn't read the FISA applications, and he didn't even prepare the scope memo that started the Mueller probe. Given that Rosenstein appears to be deeply involved in Crossfire Hurricane and that he actually picked FBI Director Christopher Wray, isn't it time that the Trump administration appoints someone else other than Wray for FBI Director?
Look, I have no announcements on that front, but what I will say with regard to the Rosenstein testimony is he said there was no there, and he now agrees with that text by Peter Strzok, who, obviously had no information of Russian collusion, but nevertheless strung us through this investigation. And you have Rosenstein, who, again, it's quite befuddling, said he wouldn't have signed off on the Carter Page FISA warrant that has his name on it. His name's signed on a FISA warrant to spy on the Trump campaign, that he wouldn't have signed off on that. Not only that, he wasn't sure that he read every page of it. It's a pretty grave thing to spy on an American citizen, to violate their Fourth Amendment rights, to not have a basis to do so, and to rely on a Russian dossier full of lies as the justification. So it's really astonishing to hear from him that he's not sure he read every page of that warrant, but I suppose it's encouraging to hear with his 2020 hindsight that he wouldn't have signed off on it, though I'm sure that's of no comfort to Carter Page.
Well, the president has expressed his disappointment in Wray in the past. So where does he stand now? Does he have confidence in Wray today?
At this moment, the president, as the FBI director, much like the Secretary of Defense is the FBI director, is the Secretary of Defense. If the president decides he no longer has confidence, you guys will be the first to know.
And then I have one more on New York, if it's okay.
Sure.
So yesterday, New York Governor Cuomo made a pretty big statement saying that he might relieve Mayor de Blasio, of his duties. Has there been any talk with Governor Cuomo about sending in the National Guard troops to New York, or is there any plan right now to send National Guard to New York?
The president will do whatever is necessary to protect America's streets. He has made that clear, and he has several tools. That is one of them, sending in the National Guard. He does have the ability to federalize the National Guard should he choose to do that. But I would note, and I'm very glad you brought up New York, the very clear-cut cases of D.C. and New York. D.C. was in chaos on Sunday night when you saw the burning of the church, when Mayor Bowser did not set the curfew as she had it at 11 p.m. The president said this is unacceptable. He's always preferred devolving to the states. They have the police power. It's their responsibility to protect the streets. But when the president saw that on Sunday night, he took action immediately. He surged the National Guard, encouraged states to accept their National Guard. He went on and on with several various actions. He gave a very powerful speech saying, if you don't act, I will. He noted that the military would be on hand should it be necessary. His bold action, his swift action, made D.C. a much different story Monday night. And contrasting the images of D.C. on Monday night and New York on Monday night, where there was rampant looting, where we saw Macy's department store looted, Coach store looted, violence in the streets. New York acted in a way that was inappropriate. They didn't deploy the National Guard. They set an 11 p.m. curfew, even after they saw the disastrous results of Mayor Bowser's 11 p.m. curfew. And the president said, I will call Antifa a domestic terrorist group. What was New York doing? New York was arresting people on burglary charges and then releasing 500 individuals after they had arrested them. So the weak-kneed policies of New York stand in stark contrast to the law and order policies of this president that has succeeded in securing this city, as we've seen the last two nights. Next, over to Lachlan.
Thank you, Kayleigh. Putting aside the conduct of individual officers, does the president believe that there's a systemic bias in American law enforcement against African Americans?
The president believes that there are injustices, and he has pointed them out, and he has not hesitated in pointing out injustices, going back to his time as a primary candidate when he called Sandra Bland and the use of force against her in the video that we all saw terrible. He did not hesitate when he saw the video of George Floyd. He was really upset by that video, as I noted. We've got the civil rights investigation into Ahmaud Arbery. He points out injustices, but he also notes this, that our police officers are good people. I've seen them out there on the streets protecting people. I've played the videos for you of the police embracing protesters, standing with the protesters. They're good, hardworking people. They protect our streets. That is what law enforcement is about. But at the same time, the president will note and he will call out injustices. And this is a president who's not hesitated in doing that when the time was right.
Individual actions, but does he believe that the problem is systemic and endemic to American law enforcement?
The president believes there are some examples of injustices. He calls them out. This is a president who, when Democrats for so many years talked about criminal justice reform and the disparities, the racial disparities in sentencing, President Obama didn't do that. Guess who fixed that? It was President Trump with the First Step Act, who engaged in sentencing reform and who really rectified some of the disparities we saw there. So, I think Democrats, others, Republicans should hail this president for calling out injustices when he sees them, either in a case-by-case basis or in the form of the First Step Act, where he noted the disparity in sentencing reforms. Josh.
There's been a number of explanations on the clearing the park. One, that there was an attempt to enforce curfew. Another, that there was violent protesters from the park police. DOJ saying that it was previously going to be done anyway. Can you explain to us what the reason from the White House's perspective was for clearing the park? Why the White House wanted it done?
So it wasn't the White House. As I said, it was AG Barr who expanded it was AG Barr who said the perimeter needed to be expanded 1 block each way because we were not going to see the church burn another night. I've already gone through in meticulous detail with my friend Jem here how it came about that perimeter was eventually moved, and I'm not going to repeat myself again.
That would have been done anyway, even if it would not have been violent protesters, that would have happened?
No, there were 3 announcements. So if the protesters had remained peaceful and had moved the perimeter as they were instructed to do, not 1, not 2, but 3 times via loudspeaker, it would have looked different. But when bricks are thrown, rest assured, officers will protect themselves. Chanel.
The question you said, the president said today that he went down to the basement to inspect it over the weekend. What was the point of the inspection? What was he looking for?
Look, I won't go further than what the president has said because those are security matters, and I won't engage on that kind of discussion. Yes, Chanel.
Really? So going back to Rosenstein, what is the president's response to the fact that neither Rosenstein nor Christopher Wray seem willing to take responsibility for the illegal wiretapping that took place on the Trump campaign? I also have a question on the Insurrection Act.
Yeah, I would say, look, the president is dismayed. This happened to the president's campaign. A Republican campaign was spied on by a Democratic presidency, a Democratic administration, based on a dossier paid for by his opponent, Hillary Clinton, and the DNC. This is absolutely extraordinary. It is the biggest political scandal that we've seen, and the lack of journalistic curiosity on this front is appalling when you have multiple instances.
Okay. All right, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany, she's been holding a press briefing as protests continue across the country. We did have some breaking news that we want to get back to. This hour, Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar tweeting that the state's attorney general is planning to increase a charge against the Minneapolis police officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck from 3rd degree up to 2nd degree murder. She also said he plans to charge the other 3 officers who were there. No word on what those charges will be. Joining me now is Jim Trusty, former DOJ prosecutor and IFRA law partner. Jim, tell me what you think about this increasing the charge from the 3rd degree to 2nd degree. What does that mean?
Well, it probably means that they were finally able to get together a grand jury. Remember, in the age of coronavirus, it's actually pretty hard to get people together, and most of the states have realized you can't do this virtually. You literally have to bring grand jurors together to hear evidence and pass indictments. So I'm assuming this is going to be an indictment today, which means they got a grand jury together. The indictment process means they're free to go wherever they want. They don't have to be limited by that criminal complaint that was against Officer Chauvin for 3rd degree murder. The 2nd degree murder charge is now an intentional murder charge. It carries up to 40 years under Minnesota law. It is a serious thing. What's interesting, and you're going to hear a lot of squealing and squawking about why isn't it a 1st degree, but they made a determination, or the grand jury made a determination perhaps, that there's not sufficient premeditation over the course of whatever, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, to justify the mandatory life sentence of a 1st degree murder. That could be a close call. There could be a lot of disagreement on that, but it's not like the officer left his house that morning, I don't think, planning on killing somebody. What's really interesting, and I think Andy McCarthy commented on this earlier today, is this little bit of evidence that came out about the other officers, the bystander officers, saying something to Officer Chauvin about maybe we should let him up. That's devastating for Chauvin. That probably makes it considerably easier. Again, we don't know all the evidence, but we know that nugget, to prove a 2nd degree murder against him. It also probably makes it considerably harder to show any intentional murder on behalf of these other officers. So I think there could be a difference. We could easily see manslaughter or 3rd degree murder, which is a very close line to manslaughter, against these other officers rather than something as severe as 2nd degree or 1st degree murder.
I'm speculating here, but is there something just below manslaughter for officers that didn't, do something to pull Chauvin off of Floyd?
You could. There may be some form of reckless endangerment statute that doesn't require death resulting from the recklessness. But if you're going to prove recklessness, you might, in this case, where the person died at the hands of Officer Chauvin, I would think you would probably view it as more of either a 3rd degree murder under Minnesota law or a manslaughter. So I don't think they're going to have lesser charges below manslaughter as kind of a fallback for jury compromise. But we'll see. They could.
But they are, Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, in her tweet, she says that Keith Ellison, the Attorney General of Minnesota, is expected to charge the other 3 officers. So do you think that will possibly be in manslaughter?
I think there's a good chance that it'll be a little bit less than what we're seeing with Officer Chauvin. I mean, he is the primary actor. Accomplice liability cases are always tough. And it comes down to all these little nuggets of conversation. What did they hear from the people on the sidewalk? What could they hear from Mr. Floyd himself? And of course, what were they saying while this was happening? If it comes off like these officers were essentially standing guard and not intervening and not allowing this horrible event to break in a normal course, but instead to allow Officer Chauvin to do what he did, then they could easily have criminal liability. And I think it could be defined as somewhere between gross negligence and recklessness. And that's really that line between manslaughter and third-degree murder.
Can I ask you also just one last question? The Justice Department, through the Attorney General, Bill Barr, at the direction of the President, was expediting an investigation into whether any civil rights were violated here in this case. Would that apply still in this case? You think that investigation continues?
I think it does, and part of that is the feds can bring some resources that can be shared with everybody. So they might be doing a very comprehensive investigation. Look, one of the issues in a civil rights investigation is you have to prove a discriminatory intent. In other words, that this did not happen but for Officer Chauvin's desire to kill someone based on race. So it's actually a higher standard. It's kind of a higher standard than premeditation in some ways that they would have to use. But it's not unusual to kind of shadow the state investigation to make sure that things work out the right way. If there is a disaster on the state front where they think there's some sort of injustice, then they have that backup. It's not subject to double jeopardy because it's a separate government that allows the feds to swoop in and take another shot at it if things go bad. That's what I would expect here. The state system will probably move more expeditiously. The federal system may well place those charges, but they're really probably going to be more of a safety net than any sort of independently needed prosecution.
All right. And that's why you're our trusty lawyer, Jim Trusty. Thank you.
All right. See you, Danny.
Joining me now is Fayetteville Police Chief Gina Hawkins. Gina, it's wonderful to have you here. Maybe I'll just get your initial reaction to this news that the charge against Chauvin is going to bump from third degree up to second degree, and that we are apparently expecting charges against the other three officers today.
My reaction is good. Accountability on every officer at the scene is important. So you are right. I just heard that. Great. Movement is taking place for justice.
Do you think that in your experience and I want to talk about something remarkable that happened there in Fayetteville at your direction, but I do also want to ask you if you think that these additional charges of the other three officers, will that answer some sort of call that the peaceful protesters have been asking for?
You know, that is possibly an expectation of hope of they see true action taking place. We hope so, but at the same time, we have an accountability responsibility part to get engaged in listening for across the nation. So we hope we hope that movement takes place. That would be great.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about something that happened. It was a very moving scene there was a line of protesters, a line of your officers. Describe what happened to us here.
So basically, the Fayetteville Police Department, we have been committed and dedicated to true community policing. That involves actions, that involves attitude, that involves daily service. So we're engaged with things like Citizens Police Academy, Coffee with a Cop. We have multiple things to include. As we live in the community, we do things like play basketball because we're residents. On this day, intention moment, as we do our job, behind the scene, one of the officers who always plays basketball with members of that protester start communicating from the lowest level possible, the relationship building. And as those communication efforts occurred, my officer, as an individual officer, not even a commander, not even a supervisor, went to his chain of command supervisor and explained what the protesters were requesting. The only thing they were requesting is empathy. They were requesting for us as members of the community to stand in solidarity of the cause. And we've come out early on when we saw this as a department to share. We are appalled what we saw. That is not us. So what they were asking was for us to show our efforts. So when that came, as I was watching everything that was occurring from my information center, as it was occurring, and they called me and said, all they want is for us to kneel. I said, and why are we waiting? That was awesome as we watched it. You know, it's part of building trust, because the trust efforts were the commitment of, if you take this knee with us and show you support the efforts that we're protesting, then we will agree to move on for the next day, or the next steps are part of the conversation. And when it happened,
wow,
from everyone on the scene who was emotional on both sides, when I tell you my officers were emotional, just as the community was emotional, that showed a sign for our community to share who we are, which is there's some change and movement coming. There's some conversation. There's some listening opportunities coming. And my heart was very filled with that.
I hear you. I know that your motto is tolerate, connect, and empathize. Police Chief Gina Hawkins, it was a remarkable scene. Thank you for showing us the way.
Thank you for the opportunity to come on and share.
You bet. All right, more on the daily briefing next. First, let's check in with Bill Hemmer.
Hey,
Bill.
Dana, good afternoon to you. A busy day here in moments. Ben Crump is the attorney for the Floyd family. He will join me live. Also, healing America in these broken cities. Dr. Ben Carson is here live to talk about that. And this Rosenstein hearing, hot at times. We'll talk to a senator who's in the room. We will see you top of the hour, 9 minutes away here on Bill Hemmer Reports.
More now on the breaking news out of Minnesota and new charges over the death of George Floyd. Let's bring in Lawrence Jones, Fox News analyst and Fox Nation host, and Wendy Osefo. She's assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. Great to have you both. Lawrence, we've been talking about this for more than a week. This was what a lot of people were waiting for, about what would happen in regards to the other three officers. And now Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, has tweeted that she believes the Attorney General of Minnesota is about to charge those officers and increase the officer who killed Floyd from, or suspected, I should say, of killing Floyd from 3rd degree up to 2nd degree. Let's get your thoughts, and then we'll get Wendy's too.
Yeah, it's crazy that she's the one announcing this, because maybe if she would have did her job in the first place, we wouldn't be here talking about this. But that's beside the point. Dana, we talked about this Friday, and I kind of set the scene for this based on the evidence that was provided for us, and just with my experience, that there was a case to be made that the intent was there based on the pulse situation. When one officer tells him to turn him on his side, and then the other officer takes the pulse, and then after that he stays on his neck for 2 minutes and 46 seconds after that. And so I'm assuming this was presented to the grand jury. I think it's going to be hard for the 1st degree, but the 2nd degree definitely made sense to me on Friday.
And Wendy, what about the fact that the other 3 officers are expected to be charged today?
We need those charges against the other 3 officers. And I'm glad to hear that Minnesota will be bringing those charges, because in this country, we have a system of racial injustice. We continue to fight as Black people for equality, and to see people who are supposed to be the peacekeepers in our society continuously harm people of color, Black people, and then get away with it is a problem, and it needs to be addressed. So yes, I am glad that there are going to be charges against the other 3 officers. officers. I am applauding that the officer Chauvin, he's going to be charged with second-degree murder. But what I really need is a conviction, because charges are great, but these officers need to be held accountable and they need to be convicted, because Black people can no longer be seen as a threat merely because of the color of our skin in this country. It is high time for that to stop.
Lawrence, as this news filters out across the country, what do you think the impact might be, if any, on the protests?
Well, I think it will bring some calm, and I mean, the majority of the protest has been peaceful. It's only been the outside groups that came in that had their agenda. But I think that what people are going to continue to ask for is a review of the entire department, and that's one hopeful thing with the DOJ coming in. You know, there's one thing, and I'm going to talk about this later on when we're closing the 5 together. One thing that really still troubles me is the autopsy report and the difference between the independent autopsy. As you know, the coroner's office is a part of the state, and the fact that he wasn't able to find such clear evidence that we saw with our own eyes and apply that to the autopsy is very concerning to me. So I think it will bring some calm. But like Wendy said, my friend, people are going to want a conviction, and they'll be waiting for that.
Absolutely.
Wendy, I have about 30 seconds left. Let me give you the last word.
Along with
the New York Police Commissioner and the brother of George Floyd here now.